Yeah, so as Paul said, I'm going to focus on the changes to benefits and tax credits that the Chancellor announced yesterday. And obviously there's one big headline policy, the cancelling of the cuts to tax credits that were due to come in next April. Before we turn to that, let's take a look at the bigger picture. So, taking a step back, the government is still planning to cut annual benefit spending by 12 billion by the time we get to the end of the Parliament. So that's the 12 billion that was mentioned in the Conservative manifesto, although note that, as indeed was the case back in July, they're delivering it much later than they promised. So cuts are increasingly backloaded towards the second half of this Parliament, with less than half of the changes to welfare spending being delivered by 2017-18, the original manifesto deadline. Just to remind you where that money's coming from, most of this isn't new, well, none of this is new. 4 billion from a freeze on most working age benefits through to April 2020. 4 or 5 billion pounds of additional cuts to universal credits, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And also about £1.5 billion of cuts to housing benefit spending, some of which is new, plus some other changes that are pretty small that I'm not going to have time to discuss. So a big cut in the generosity of the benefit system coming on top of large cuts under the coalition government. And the effect of all that is that once you get rid of state pensions, benefit spending in 2021 is forecast to be at its lowest share of national income for about 30 years. So here what we're doing is just looking at that figure, total spending excluding state pensions, as a percentage of GDP. So you can see between 1979 right through to 2010, it's kind of rising gradually, bit ups and downs in recessions, and then it kind of spikes up as you would expect as the Great Recession hit in 2008, 2009. Coalition government comes to office, and spending starts to fall as a share of GDP from about 8% in 2009-10 down to roughly 6.5% now. And the plans are for that to keep falling, down to about 5%, just over 5% of GDP by 2020-21. And as you can see, that's lower at any time since about 1989. So, the Chancellor in some sense hasn't gone soft. There's still significant cuts to the generosity of the working age benefit system planned over the current Parliament. But he did make a big U-turn. So back in the July 2015 budget, the Chancellor announced lots and lots of changes to benefits, and two of those changes were to tax credits for low-income working families due to come in April 2016. So in particular, he hoped to save the government £4.5 billion by cutting how much you can earn as a family before your tax credits start to be withdrawn, and then also increasing the rate at which they're withdrawn as your income rises beyond that point. So a £4.4 billion cut in spending, which was cancelled at a cost of £3.4 billion, which, as Paul pointed out, isn't something that we've missed. It's actually those numbers are different, and largely they're different because the government made a mistake. Together, the government departments and the OBR made mistakes in the official July numbers, and so most of that is explained by that. There's also a small change to forecasting that explains a little bit of the difference. So that was the big announcement. The other announcement with the potential to have significant long-run effects was, as Paul mentioned, the housing benefit cut for social tenants. So the way the system works at the minute is that in the private sector, there are caps on how much rent the government's willing to cover in housing benefit, and those depend on where you are and how many bedrooms the government thinks you're entitled to in your house. Now, those caps currently don't apply to those in the social sector, those renting from councils or housing associations. But they are going to apply from April 2018, admittedly only on tenancies signed from next April onwards. And the government expects that to cut housing benefit spending by about 200 million in 2020-21. But obviously, because this policy is only applying to new tenancies, its effect will accumulate slowly over time. And so we estimate that if you applied it instead to all social tenants now, the cut would be about just over £1 billion, and that's on a base of about £25 billion that we spend in housing benefit in total, and of that 25 billion, about 15 billion is spent on tenants in the social sector. The effect of that would be 800,000 households losing an average of £1,300 a year. That's the amount of rent on average they'd have to be covering, where previously the government would have picked up the tab. And it's worth saying that those numbers are calculated on the basis of the current relationship between social rents and these housing benefit caps. So in the short run, social rents are going to fall, but historically, what's happened is that social rents have risen in real terms. Now, these caps in the housing benefit system are indexed to CPI, and so as social rents rise faster than caps, potentially in the future, we'd expect the savings from this policy to rise, or in other words, the size of the impact to increase. The final thing that's worth saying is that the caps themselves are increasingly arbitrary and in need of reform. So they're no longer linked to actual rents in different parts of the country for different kinds of properties. They're linked to historic rents back in 2012, and so they're bearing increasingly little resemblance as time moves on to actual rents, and obviously that problem's just getting worse and worse over time. So we're now going to look at the impact in the short run of the tax and benefit changes, so looking just at changes coming in April 2016. So before yesterday's autumn statement, so the way we're going to do that, is to look at a standard IFS decile chart. So we've lined the population up with the poorest on the left and the richest on the right and put them in 10 equally sized groups. And so that's going to show us the distributional effect of changes. So before yesterday's autumn statement, you can see that there were some falls in income towards the bottom of the distribution, and that was primarily driven by the two tax credit cuts due to come in April 2016. And you can see that because when I update this line in light of yesterday's announcements, those falls basically go away. And so the pattern is that in the short run, changes in April 2016 are going to have little effect, and in particular, they're no longer going to reduce the incomes for some low-income working families. But we might care more about the long-run impact. So what we're going to do now is exactly the same graph, poorest on the left, richest on the right, exactly the same scale. What's the long-run impact of all the tax and benefit changes that the government has already introduced or plans to introduce between May 2015 and April 2019? Now, it's worth being very clear here. When we say long run, we mean very long run. So we've got universal credit fully in place with no transitional protection, and all the changes that apply to existing claimants, we're going to model them as being fully in place, so everybody's affected. So in this very long run world, before the autumn statement, it looked like this. So large falls in income towards the bottom of the distribution. And that's driven by lots of cuts to benefit entitlements. Post-autumn statement, not a lot. If anything, slightly more, and that's the housing benefit cut. So just to remind you, this is what the short-run picture looks like. You can see the impact of the autumn statement picking up that line at the bottom. That's the long-run picture. Now, it's worth being clear that what we're not saying is that lots of poor families will see cash cuts to their entitlements. What we're saying is that in the long run, the system will be significantly less generous to low-income families, both in and out of work. And that is the big headline, not the U-turn. So what's the reason for that big pattern we see? Well, lots of other benefit cuts were announced in July, and they're still going ahead. And indeed, a couple more announced yesterday. So just a couple of big ones were the freeze in benefits until 2020 and the two-child limit, which applies both in tax credits and universal credits. The second reason, the reason why those lines simply lie on top of each other, is that the reversal of the tax credit cuts makes no difference in the long run. And that's because, as the Chancellor said, tax credits are being replaced by universal credits. And I'll come back to that in more detail in a minute. It's worth saying that the flip side of taking away these benefits from low-income families, both in and out of work, is that actually, as recent research that we published last week shows, in the long run, work incentives are strengthened by these changes. And there are two reasons for that. Firstly, there were big cuts to out-of-work benefits as well as in-work benefits. And secondly, by reducing the amount of support that one-earner couples receive, you mean that you make the effect is that those with working partners stand to lose less benefit income by moving into work, and that strengthens their incentives. So coming back to that second point, the fact that the reversal of tax credit cuts makes no difference in the long run. So the key point here is that universal credit, unlike tax credits, unlike that bit of tax credits, is still much less generous than it was at the time of the election. So bit of crucial background. Universal credit is replacing tax credits along with 4 of the means-tested benefits. And under the previous plan, universal credit was roughly as generous as the system it replaces, on average, although there are pretty significant gains and losses for different families. But universal credit was unaffected by yesterday's tax credit U-turn. So you had these two systems that were equally generous, the Chancellor chose to reverse tax credits, making the current system more generous, but not doing anything to UC. So, for example, the cuts to work allowances in universal credit that were announced in July, as Paul mentioned, those are going ahead, and actually they will affect a very similar group to those who would have been affected by the tax credit cuts. And that's because they're a very similar policy. So the biggest part of the tax credit cuts was this reduction in how much I can earn before my tax credits start to be withdrawn. So let's have a look at what a cut to the work allowance universal credit does. So this is an example family, couple with 2 children, owner-occupiers. And we're going to look at how their universal credit entitlement changes with their net income, so income after they paid tax. So before the work allowance cut announced back in July, they would have had £12,000 of universal credit income, and they'd have kept all of that until their until their net income hits about £6,500. And at that point, they lose 65p for every additional pound. But that point was cut to £5,000, less than £5,000, back in July. And as a result, if they're kind of anywhere where those 2 lines are apart, they lose £1,000, roughly £1,000 of universal credit income. So you can see that this particular cut to universal credit has very similar effects to the tax credit cut that Mr. Osborne reversed. It means that low-income working families will receive less benefits. So that's a very particular aspect of the system, but taking a step back, what can we say now about universal credit and the system it's replacing? Well, and by that, what we mean is the incremental impact of including universal credit. So once you've already taken into account other cuts to benefits. So the key difference is that universal credit now represents an additional cut on top of other changes. So we estimate that in the long run, it will cut benefit entitlements by £3.7 billion a year. And that's because although existing claimants are protected in cash terms when they're moved on to universal credit, new claimants and those whose circumstances change will find that new system to be less generous than the old one. So splitting that number out a bit, 4.5 million families, roughly that, will be affected by the introduction of universal credit. And in the long run, 2.6 million of those will lose an average of £1,600 a year, offset to some extent by 1.9 million gaining an average of £1,400 a year, meaning that the total cut for working families will be £1.5 billion a year. And it's worth making sure that we grasp that that is a very different picture to the one at the time of the election. So at the time of the election, universal credit was good news for low-income working families. It was going to increase their incomes. But that's no longer true. Instead, it's going to reduce them on average. Now, here are the equivalent figures for non-working families, but these haven't been much changed by anything since the election. This was always true. It's just that it used to be that universal credit was roughly neutral on average, with working families gaining on average and non-working families losing. Now, both types of family lose from universal credit, and it's a big cut. Everything I've said, and indeed all the numbers the government have produced on the impact of the tax credit tax credit changes, depends on an assumption about how universal credit will be rolled out. Now, that assumption is somewhat subject to change. So what we're going to look at here is for lots of different fiscal events since March 2013, what was the assumption then about how universal credit would be rolled out? So, for example, thinking back to March 2013, the assumption, which now looks a tad optimistic, was that we would have, say, nearly 5 million people claiming universal credit in 2015-16, so kind of roughly halfway through. The current figure is around 100,000. So slightly optimistic. So by the time we get to December 13, you can see that 2015-16's taken a bit of a hit from nearly 5 million to about 500,000 people, and the rest of the rollout schedule has shifted out. By the time we get to December 2014, the OBR have stopped believing DWP. So now we've got 2 different lines. What DWP say is going to happen, and what the OBR think that actually means. July, worse again. November, worse again. Oh, and DWP still don't believe the OBR, so you got another one at the end. So you can see that the government is currently planning on, I guess, the orange line, or maybe the red line, I'm not sure there. But that plan is subject to change. So to sum up, clearly the biggest decision the Chancellor took yesterday was to scrap a number of planned cuts to tax credits. These 2 would have come in April 2016. But that U-turn has no long-run effect on the generosity of the benefit system. And that's because tax credit is being replaced by universal credit, and universal credit was unaffected by yesterday's announcement. And so the big picture is that the government is still planning deep cuts to working age benefits, including for low-income working families, though it's worth noting that the overall package will strengthen their work incentives on average.